I'm very happy to be here and to share some considerations, some clues about how to read the conjuncture and how can we work together in the construction of the solid foundations for an alliance of all the peoples in the world in order to stop the destructive, the ferocity and the velocity of this global crisis. As I mentioned yesterday, this is not the case of the 1% against the 99%. This is the case of the whole humanity against a bunch of people, a very narrow oligarchy, whose agenda includes a lot of issues that maybe you could find in Plato when he described the characteristics of oligarchy. Most of those points could lead you to think about a kind of exaggeration, but if you pay attention to the recent events, you are going to find that is indispensable to explore which are the scientific foundations, which are the dynamics, the economic and social dynamics behind this type of societal push. War, chaos, destabilization are very profitable issues. So in order to preserve peace, in order to preserve the right of everybody to dignity and prosperity, we need to deploy a very rigorous diagnosis about what is going on, but also to base upon them which kind of political actions, which kind of initiatives can we deploy in order to prevent this and to, on the contrary, create alternatives, no? Societal alternatives. Okay, so I think it is important to break down the common sense that is a nonsense, that this is a financial crisis that went sour. What happens in 2008 was the financial implosion of a structural crisis of overproduction of capital. The notion of overproduction is itself repugnant. How come you could have overproduction when there are so many people fighting every day for survival? And as a matter of fact, contrary to what most of the economic textbooks say and continue to teach, modern crises are crises of abundance, not of scarcity. The real problem of capitalism is that it is the prisoner of its own success, its own productivist success. So in order to understand this, I think it's crucial to see how the revolutionary content of capitalism had transformed the whole planet during the last 500 years. The permanent introduction of science and technology not only transformed the labor process, generating a tremendous dominion on the development of the productive forces, but it had also spilled over the rest of the society, impregning the whole social life of an instrumental rationality that is at the root of capitalist modernity. So people like Marx and Engels were very adamant in praising the historical conquest of capitalism. They are dead for more than 100 years, and even though capitalism had continued to deploy to exude a lot of technical progress and a lot of material conditions for the emancipation of humankind out of the realm of necessity and misery, at the same time had created the opposite. And never, as in the last few years, in the last maybe decades, the effort of big capital to preclude the possibility of technical progress is now the constant. That is why now in the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific public-private partnership, in the initiative of the Pacific, in the free trade agreements, in the new negotiations at the WTO, at the level of the bilateral investment treaties, the most important issues are not related to trade, beyond the propaganda, are related to deregulation, intellectual property, and establishment. That means it's related to the institutional arrangements in order to create the conditions for rent seeking and to prevent the productive deployment of a humongous arsenal of innovations that are not desired by capital, but by big capital, precisely because that is going to exacerbate the problem of overproduction. Hard to admit it. But it's not only in quantitative terms, it's also in qualitative terms. You know, you still have in internet a bubble that, a light bulb that is still working after 120 years, that was fabricated by Thomas Alva Edison. Any one of these lights has been programmed to broken after, I don't know, 1,000 hours, for example. And the same happens with the clothes, and the same happens with the computers, and the same happens with the automobile industry, etc., etc. Capital needs a programmed obsolescence. Capital needs to create the dispositives to surmount the problems of market saturation, niche by niche. And that implied a transformation of the axis in the main drive of capitalism from the technical progress, from the material advance of modernity, to an era of waste, of contamination, and the destruction of productive forces. Now you have, if during the 50s, the 60s, you have, for example, General Motors, Ford, working with engineers in new materials, in aerodynamic techniques, in the possibility of new developments in their industry. Now the engineers are mostly devoted to prevent the possibility of other firms to take advantage of the diffusion of technology. And that within the center, the core of the empire. That situation is, of course, much worse when you are talking about geopolitical issues, when you are talking about North-South relationships, when you are talking about rivalry among the industries. So the constitution of the new semi-peripheries, first, after the defeat of the fascist forces in the Second World War, the reconstruction of Europe, the social democratic reconstruction of Europe, the counter-insurgent reforms in Tokyo, in Japan, in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia. Now you have another type of semi-peripheries, not only because we are in the middle of a new wave of avant-garde technologies, not only because we are at the verge, kind of blocked, asphyxiated, development of a new scientific and technological revolution, but because in geopolitical terms is the first time that, for example, the BRICS are related to geographies that are not militarily occupied by NATO. And that, jointly with the desperate situation in terms of the decline of the previous hegemons, not only the United States, but also Britain and the continental Europe, had created a very dangerous situation for the species, for the survival of the species. Again, taking into consideration that war has been always a very profitable business. So we have to to remind ourselves that the previous structural crisis of overproduction of capitalism was the root cause of the First and the Second World Wars. And the whole financial and commercial warfare in between. So the disputes, the inter-imperialist disputes are at the core of the current situation. So that is why it's so important to have a very rigorous analysis above all the nature itself of imperialism. To miss a correct diagnosis about the motives and the modus operandi of imperialism, to miss the real understanding of the nature of the accumulation to the global scale, could lead us not only to economic failures, but also to political catastrophes, like when in the previous decades a very adventurous diagnosis of social imperialism defined political blunders all around the Third World that created a division in the possibilities of a force, an anti-imperialist force, like what Darwin was telling us in The Spirit of Bandung. In the case of Latin America, the guerrilla against the Sandinist front, or the opposition to the Allende and Unidad Popular government in Chile, and a lot of these very, very ugly experiences. So within this framework, we need to understand the real dangers and the real dimensions of this current crisis of civilization. We are not talking about the collapse of capitalism. We are talking about the possibility of a long period of degradation of civilization, a long period of destruction of the same conquest of the capitalist modernity. And that is very important because it is a common token to hear about the crisis of capitalism. It's a senile capitalism, this is a terminal crisis of capitalism, but nobody, or it's very, very scarce, the real reflection about the theoretical, political, and historical consequences of that diagnosis. You know, if you are really convinced that this is a structural crisis of capitalism, the real consequence of this is that it is not possible to get rid of this crisis without getting rid of capitalism. If this is the terminal crisis of capitalism, if in the cycle of life of this mode of production we are in the senile stage, we need to derive the political consequences of this. You know, and when you talk about reformism, when you talk about Keynesianism, you must understand that Keynesianism in the previous regime of accumulation, namely the previous way in which capitalism existed, is totally different than what you could have today. Among other things, because it's lethal for the current structure of monopolization, is lethal for the current demands of rates of profits to have a relaunch of productivity. The possibility of inundating again the world with commodities too cheap for the rates of profits, for the level of profitability that the current structure of monopolies are demanding is at the root of the current currency wars, of the current financial war, and at the heating of the geopolitical tension. So, beneath the surface of macroeconomic and financial indicators, the structural crisis has worsened during these years. Look, it is not only the GDP, it is not only the rates of growth of trade, it is the new role of speculation. We are not talking about the traditional notion of financial capital. This is not Hilferding. The reference is not Hilferding. You know, even at the level of monopolies, you have two very different societal logics, two very different derives in terms of the dynamics of power reproduction within the same banks even. Maybe at some point we can discuss with details what happens within, for example, the business plan of Deutsche Bank, or maybe the business plan of the big Chinese banks today. There is a kind of schizophrenia, not only within one social category, not only within one institution, but even within each CEO. Because we are in the middle of a historical bifurcation. We are in the middle of an unprecedented tension between what is possible and what is actual. We could end up in a solution, in a very democratic horizon, humanistic horizon that could bring prosperity for 7 billion people, or we could plunge into a very sordid dynamics of degradation. And the key of that situation is the monetary and financial evolution. And that is, I was suggesting in previous sessions, the importance to distinguish between the determinant and the duality between the determinant and the determinated, and the dominant and the dominated. The determinant pole of the current evolution is production. The determinant pole of the current evolution is that we are in the middle of a tremendous scientific and technological revolution that has been blocked by the main powers involved, monopoly capital. The dominant forces are oriented around the margin of maneuver of financial and monetary manipulation. That hasn't happened in the history of capitalism for centuries. Fernand Braudel, Giovanni Arrighi, Marx himself had written extensively about the importance of the taming of capital in the sphere of circulation, both in commerce and in terms of usury, in order to have the historical conditions that could render capital a social relationship of exploitation, a mode of production. China, for example, last time that we went to visit the splendor of the Chinese empire during the 11th, the 13th century, you find a very extensive domestic market, a very active market with a large homogeneous population, but not capitalism, not productive capitalism, not the mode of production as such. And the same happened in the north of Italy in the 12th and 13th century. And the same happened during the golden years of the Caliphate, the Abbasid and the Umayyads. It was the specific conditions of the peripheral tributary mode of production that created the possibility of obtaining, of submitting capital in the sphere of circulation in order to create the pair equation of the rate of profit that make viable capital, the relationship of production capital as the new way of production. Today, the hypertrophy, the parasitarian hypertrophy of the financial sector had reversed that situation. For the first time, the drive of monopolic, I'm not talking about minor fractions of capital, of monopolic productive capital in the center of the empire has been asphyxiated by the priorities and the logic of financial speculative capital. And I'm not talking about the periphery, I'm not talking about the semi-periphery, I'm not talking about secondary powers, I'm talking about the United States and the continental Europe. And Japan. I'm talking the core, the center, the heart of the empire. So it is very important to pay attention to the new nature. The indicators or the statistics could show the same name, the same label, but actually they are reflecting a very different phenomenon. This time, those bubbles, that bubbleization of the economy is not only a matter of quantitative spread. It is also a different nature of bubbles. We have now a structural distortion in the mechanisms of price formation. Let me return to this after presenting you some details about what I'm talking about. Look, this is not a financial crisis from the subprime that spread, that created contagion, like the majority and even Marxist economists used to say. What we have today is the exhaustion, the collapse of the remedies to the structural crisis of capitalism. Globalization and financiarization were the remedies to the structural crisis, was the mitigation of the symptoms of overproduction already present, already pushing, already gravitant during the 60s. The golden years of capitalism that generated the highest rates of profits, the highest rates of growth in the post-war, were asphyxiated, between quotes, because the rates of profit were not satisfying the exigencies of the oligarchy. In the previous session, I presented you contundent, overwhelming evidence of the difference between the behavior, the performance of the 200 largest corporations in the United States vis-a-vis the situation of the rest of the United States enterprises. Even taking into account the tremendous transfer of wealth, the tremendous surplus value transfer from the South after the programmed triggering of the external debt crisis. So what you have there is that in order to improve the conditions of profitability of the big corporations, you enter in a very sustained process of destruction of the internal coherence of the national space, of the social space within the nation states. United States, for example, during the whole history of the United States, especially after the secession war, the coherence of the productive apparatus within the United States was such that only 5-7%, even during war, 5-7% of the market was an external one. Basically, what was produced in the United States was sold in the United States. If you have statistics, combined statistics about the continental Europe, you have almost the same. And that gives you a very important clue about the type of nightmares for the Anglo-American diplomacy presented by the prospect of an Euro-Asian continent. The continuity of a domestic market, the continuity of a horizon of prosperity, capitalist prosperity, please. We are talking about capitalism. The prospect of a capitalist bonanza from Gibraltar to Kamchatka is a nightmare for a structure of power, centuries rooted upon the maritime power. Paradoxically, more or less the same happened in the United States. That is why today you have a very poignant conflict between Wall Street and Main Street. The appearance of the emergency of candidacies like Bernie Sanders and Trump is a very clear evidence of the type of deep delegitimation within the block of power among the elites in the United States. The emergency of the extreme right and nationalistic extreme right in continental Europe is part of the same contradiction. The recent experience of Brexit, even if controlled, is part of very deep pugnancies. And I think it is very crucial for the deployment of a political strategy, building peace, building prosperity, and blocking the consolidation of a neo-fascist project is precisely to take into account this type of discrepancies in order to make alliances. I'm not talking about the electoral alliances. But in order to create the balance of power, we need to do globally the correct reading of this type of contradictions. So what today has been exhausted is the possibility of continuing the expedient of profitability based upon delocalization and financiarization. On one hand, you have the exacerbation of the macroeconomic disequilibria, because, of course, this structuration of the dynamic coherence at the level of the nation states had created a huge problem of debt. And at the core of this, pay attention to this, at the core of that situation, you have the global monopoly of liquidity, transactionality, and the international reserves of the dollar and the Anglo-American network. And on the other hand, you have the problem of financialization. If it is counterproductive to continue to deepen the crisis of overproduction with more productive investments, the solution, between quotes, is to open opportunities, profitable opportunities in the short run into the financial realm. But that had led to a situation of tremendous hypertrophy in the financial sector that had asphyxiated the evolution of the productive sector. Instead of facilitating, instead of the functionality of the financial apparatus that you had in the previous centuries, today you have a very dysfunctional and even contentious behavior, performance, drive on behalf of the financial powers against monopolic productive capital. And again, at the center of that discrepancy, at the center of this margin of maneuver between powers in the summit of the elites is the global monopoly of transactionality, liquidity, credit, and finance that has the dollar. That is why, look, the two most important factors to mitigate the structural crisis of overproduction for the last 50 years had led to a dead end. And the vortex of this situation in both cases is related to the Anglo-American network and the monopoly of the dollar on money and finance. And again, in both cases, the divortium aquarum, in both cases, the point of even military tension is related to the role of the semi-periphery. China in the first place. We are not talking about a description. We are not talking about arbitrary conditions. We are talking about systemic trends. We are talking about the hierarchical ontology of the contradictions. I'm not picking it up because I am in China. I'm trying to follow which are the main vectors endogenous to the system. So, the real condition of senectude, the real condition of the lack of alternatives for capital do not come from wishful thinking. You know, they don't have any possibility other than being other thing. The logic of monopoly capital requires a hierarchization of the profit rate. The hierarchization of profit rates demands the segmentation of the market and the control of the effective demand. They could deploy a new launch, a new resume of the dynamics, vigorous dynamics of capitalism if they allow the deployment of the scientific and technological revolution. But that is going to provoke a democratization of capital. That is going to provoke a transformation in the formation of profit rates. You know, if you read, for example, David Ricardo or Adam Smith, the normal rates of profit that you have in the 19th century was 4-6%. In some of those, I don't remember if it was, I don't know, John Stuart Mill mentioned, because he was an employee of the East Indian British Company, he mentioned the difference between the normal rate of profit and the rate of profit around 25-30% than the East Indian British Company had. Among other things, with the incipient opium trade that led to the 3 opium wars against China. But beyond narcotraffic, the normal rate of return at that time was 4-6%. Today, the banks are demanding the ROE of 30%, without taking into account the role of the offshores, of the tax havens, the shell companies, the shadow banking, and all the fake names that they use in order to arbitrage, in order to avoid regulation and taxes. So it is very important to understand that it is not technically impossible to have another perspective, another societal perspective. The problem is that one minuscule oligarchy, I mentioned before the statistics of Oxfam, 62 persons, 62 individuals control the same income of 3.6 billion human beings. So that is the level of of concentration of economic and political power that we are suffering today. So it is very important to understand this, because we are talking about the possibility of a very attractive, a very seductive horizon for the huge majority of the bourgeoisie. Even monopolistic capital could have a very attractive horizon with the deployment of another perspective, another productivist perspective, against the wishes of this minuscule fraction of speculative capital. Okay, some evidence that you have in your paper, the increasing level of idle capacity everywhere. This is a very quantitative indicator, very approximated indicator that do not take into account the qualitative dimension of the current innovations. Pay attention, or put a little bit of imagination about, for example, the role of smartphone, the new generations of 4G, or put into consideration what happens with the new materials, or with biotechnology, or put into consideration what is the value added that you could find with the introduction of maglev in South America, like what we propose with the Bank of the South. The new market that you can open with this. Or put into consideration, I don't know, the 3D printer. Put in consideration the problems of technological dependency. Put in considerations the blockage to technological progress for the third and the fourth world. And you can see that today humankind is able to do anything. If you put in consideration this, the demographic crisis, the ecological crisis, the energy crisis, famine, poverty, conflicts are solvable right now. We have plenty of possibilities of solving any one of those issues, and even to restructure the pattern of consumption everywhere. You know, in the case, for example, in Cuba, in Ecuador, just changing the bulbs, the light bulbs, we were able to generate a surplus of energy equivalent to hydroelectric. Just with very simple measures of rationalization. Air conditioner, isolation in the construction of the buildings. The problem of the efficiency in transportation, that is one of the most important sources of pollution and one of the most onerous charges in terms of energy demand. The role of the the reconstruction of the nearest trade in order to reproduce the dynamic coherence between production and consumption. So again, the horizon of what is possible and what is not possible, what is technical and what could be a matter of political sovereignty of the peoples, is totally opaque because of the not only the propaganda, not only the lack of information about the technological possibilities, but also because of the attitudes and the notion of what is scientific and what is not scientific, even in the realm of the political discussion. So, for the first time in history, there are much more important efforts to prevent the deployment and the diffusion of technology. A very important part of the political agenda of the peoples must be precisely a selective awareness about the benefits of technology right now. in the field of medicine, in the field of social welfare, in the field of climate emergencies, in the field of natural catastrophes, etc., etc. There are a lot of innovations that have been blocked by the monopolies in order to make it profitable, and sometimes in order to weaponize them, like in the case of weather control and even earthquakes. Delocalization and delinking of investment had created a conundrum, a labyrinth of situations, precisely because you have the monopoly of the dollar and the Anglo-American financial network. The same financial institutions, even the same financial and monetary instruments, working from a different perspective, working with the adequate framework of regulation, submitted to the priorities of national construction and to the priorities of people's welfare, could render totally different results. Mathematical techniques of risk mitigation, mathematical techniques of efficiency in the markets today are only viable and are only applied if they created more rent-seeking behavior, more speculation, more predatory activities. But if they are put to the service of the people, to the service of the people's economy, to the service of the nations of the third world, for example, you can achieve miracles. You can achieve a lot of very important breakthroughs in terms of the limitations in the management of the fiscal budgets of each country. Relative overproduction reappeared as a profit problem and as a political claim from exacerbated monopolization. So, pay attention to this. There is nothing technical, nothing natural regarding the problem of the profit rate formation. The most important example is China itself. You know that the norm, between quotes, of the profit rate in the productive sector in China is much lower than the exigencies that you have in the West. Of course, that generates a lot of possible vulnerabilities, potential vulnerabilities, because the structure of costs is such that competition among different fractions of capital, including state-owned capital, had created a climate of very cost optimization mechanisms, opposite to what happened in the much more caution-oriented monopolies in the West. After the period of stagflation in the West, you had the very high interest rates by Mr. Volcker, and that created such a wave of bankruptcies that led very few operators in each niche of market that were able to set up prices in such a way that they were dynamically constituting their own savings, instead the need to recur to the banks. That feature has changed part of the new era, the new regime of accumulation, different from the Fordist Keynesian of the previous decades. When we are talking about the new regime of accumulation, we are not talking only of the primacy of the financial sector. We are talking about a deep internal transformation of the logic of the most important paradigms of monopolic productive capital. the examples of the enterprise, of the corporations of the previous generation, for example, General Electric, Thomas Alva Edison's General Electric, today is GE Capital. When Obama was rescuing General Motors or Ford or Chrysler, it was public that 97% of the profits of those companies came out of financing and commercializing vehicles, not from the production of vehicles. The main logic in the organigram of the manager model of those enterprises had passed from Fordism to post-Fordism to Toyotism to another type of priorities in the functioning, in the internal functioning of the enterprise, in which cash flow and short-termism are the priorities. You know, that way is not predominant here in China. Not yet. And that makes the difference. So, when we are talking about a regime of accumulation, we are talking specific way of being of the capitalist mode of production in specific coordinates of time and space. But also we are talking about specific societal projects. Yes, capital is the same always. No, capital is not the same always. Samir Amin, for example, talked about the compradora bourgeoisie. It was a bourgeoisie. Why? Because it has the monopoly of capital in the third world countries in some period of the transition between the pre-capitalist to the capitalist socio-economic formation. Yes. But the type of societal project, the type of reproduction of that structure of power led to the underdevelopment of capitalism, not to the development of capitalism that you found in the Western Europe. The same commercial bourgeoisie that in the England of the Glorious Revolution in the 17th century created the conditions for the construction of an internal market, for the future industrial revolution, for the salarization of the labor force. Under the drive of the compradora bourgeoisie, created the condition for the perennization of pre-capitalist, of archaic ways of exploitation. Created the conditions for a perennization of a specific role in the international division of labor, precluding the possibility of the construction of a nation state in a modern horizon. Today, understand those important differences could bring us light enough to see the possibility of other type of political developments, like what we are trying in a very precarious way to do in a peripheral place like Latin America. Peripheral and directly dominated place like Latin America. So pay attention to what happened at the end of the period of the Fordist Keynesian regime of accumulation, and let's see how this is not a matter of I don't know, academic erudition. We are talking about the political, historical consequences of this. We are witnessing here the sacrifice of the golden years of capitalism by its beneficiaries. It's a suicidal behavior. It's a suicidal historical behavior. They are killing the golden eggs Whose? So in a rationalistic analysis, it is absurd to say, okay, but how are they going to do this if they are losing? I presented you the statistics the other session in which even if the totality of the capitalist class was losing with the transformation from the Fordist Keynesian regime of accumulation to the neoliberal or globalized or financialized regime of accumulation, they were forced to do that because of the aspirations of profitability of the minuscule oligarchy. Well, the same could be said with respect, for example, to the First World War. There is this book by Barbara Stalin, Weapons of August. Have you seen? The Guns of August. She relates the narration, the narrative goes reporting the climate in the dominant in the government circles of the main powers of the will to be war. Nobody believed that it was going to be a war. Nobody believed that. It's absurd. You know, the gun machine was invented with the hope, between quotes, with the hope that that was going to be the dissuasion for any type of engagement in war. Look what happens in Sudan, and look what happens in the Balkans. Look what happened in the First World War. Alfred Nobel was convinced, so the biographers said, that the use of TNT was going to deter any possibility of war. It was so horrific, so terrible, the consequences of the use of those type of arms, that it was obvious that was going to block any possibility of war. And the same happens with the horizon of the atomic bomb. Look what happens in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that kind of suicidal behavior in the hands of a very concentrated capacity of decision. We are talking about 62 guys that, of course, are behind the political parties, behind the big enterprises, behind the governments, behind the media. That is what we are witnessing here. Look, yeah, as an average, they had a rate of profit that was going down, like you can see in this gross black line. But as a quantity, as a mass of profits, they were not losing. They had the highest amount of profits in whole history. The numerator continues to grow while the denominator was getting heavier and heavier because of the demands that monopolistic competitions imposed upon investment. In order to remain within the market, in order to remain in the competition, you need to put more money in machinery, in plant, in new markets, in new raw materials, etc., etc. And that impulsive behavior is today part of the game. That is at the root of the day-to-day dispute for markets, at the root of the day-to-day dispute in the currency wars. That was the key motive for the Plaza and the Louvre Accord that set up the fate of Japan, 25 years of depression, of programmed depression, as a retaliation from the Anglo-American partners in the middle of the Cold War. Pay attention what that means for the future of China. And then you have a change of the regime of accumulation, and that is not technical, it is not categories that metaphysically move themselves. It is political action, it's agency. They could do that because the society allowed them to do that. And one of the main characteristics of that coup, because it was a coup, was a very sharp tectonic shift in the structure of power, was made just picking the telephone, a black telephone, wireless telephone, by Mr. Volcker, and saying, okay, raise the interest rates without any type of institutional filter, without any type of political dispute. Not an administrative measure, without any check and balance, not even within the United States. That made that a lot of debts that you had in the third world, but also in the so-called state socialist countries that was acquired at 3%, became unviable in a matter of weeks. That created a huge transfer of resources. Look, that is imperialism, and that has been working all the time, that has been exacerbated, that has, those mechanisms, those machinations have been perfectionated, each time more and more sophisticated, in order to submit our peoples in new forms, pay attention to this, in new forms of archaic exploitation through the financial system. So it is not only the transfer of wealth through the service of the debt, the net service of the debt that you can find here, it is also all the macroeconomic, financial, and real restructuration that you provoke, that you trigger out of the urgent need to provoke surpluses in devises, in dollars. The global monopoly on transactionality, liquidity, and credit that has the Anglo-American network. Multilateralism, multipolarity is not a trivial thing, because we are talking about a very harmful behavior inflicted in billions of people just because of this technicality. If at that time Latin America or even the Soviet bloc could have a different monetary and financial arrangement, that could save the day, that could avoid this race to the bottom in order to cheapen labor force and nature in the 187 countries at the same time, desperate to find new markets and giving the same oligarchy more rent-seeking mechanisms of profitability. So today, the history repeats itself, but in these new conditions. Again, the determinant pole of the situation, even if the dominant pole is in the margin of maneuver of the monetary and financial capabilities, the determinant pole remains in the productive sector. We are talking about the transformation of the capitalist mode of production. This is not it's not a matter of money. This is not a matter of liquidity. So what you have is a transformation due to the needs of capitalism, due to the needs of monopoly capitalism at the core of the system. The Anglo-American elites, they were forced to, because of profitability reasons, to delocalize and to create, among other things, the semi-periphery in China. And that implied a very important, a very crucial geopolitical decision, because access, this is not a matter of financial and economic policies. It is a political decision. It is not only Deng Xiaoping. When Kissinger and Nixon visited President Chairman Mao, they came with the J.P. Morgan operatives. Do you know the consequences between the elites here and the J.P. Morgan functionaries, right? That alliance is still working today. Like the HSBC relationship with the elites here has been reproduced through the centuries since the Opium Wars. And that is gravitant in the evolution of the events today. Tectonic shifts have happened beneath the surface. But what remains as a basic point in terms of the horizons for humanity is here. You know, that polar shift in terms of the North-South relationships that happens because of this new creation of semi-peripheries. After the saturation of the Asian dragons and tigers, you have this. The industrial capacity is now in the global south, among others, and leading by China. If China do not surrender to the agenda of the shadow banking and speculative capital. I don't know if you were aware, when I was younger, when I was younger, I used to see those movies that was the nightmare of Hollywood, because the Japanese were buying everything. The Rockefeller Center, they were buying the plants in the town. So the yellow peril was going to invade the United States, you know? And in a matter of a blink of the eye, Japan is not a danger anymore. Haven't you realized this? Japan disappeared from the scene. They are not beggars. They are not a menace anymore. How? Basel I, the Plaza Accords. A sleight of hand, magic. Be very, very attentive, because the hand is faster than your eyes. And that is happening while we are talking. But remember, that is the determinant pole, the real conditions of production. So, for the first time, you have Agnus Madison and Gordon, and today even Thomas Piketty had reconstructed long-term series, historical series, that showed you the previews that there is nothing natural in the current order of things. China had a very important weight in the global GDP until the Opium Wars, until the period of the British free trade. Pay attention to this. India, the same. On the opposite, Latin America has had almost the same weight during the centuries. I think it's important to pay attention to this type of issues. Again, this transformation in the dynamics, you know, here the deterioration and the negative trend in the productivity of the manufacturing sector in the core of the system versus the exponential growth in the productivity, in the manufacturing productivity in the emergent countries is showing you tremendous potential. But if you compute these statistics for the recent years, you are going to see a decline in the dynamics of the South, the global South productivity, including China's. And you have a recovery in this trend precisely because of the geopolitical efforts deployed especially by the own United States. And we are talking a United States in which Detroit, Flint, Gary, the core of the previous industrial capability, the core of the technological belt in the United States today are ghost towns. And even though the United States had managed to recover in a very, very rapid, impressive way during the last few years, even after the financial crisis exploded in its own territory. So, when we are talking about the capitalist mode of production, to have a metaphor with respect to physics, we are talking about the contradictory dynamics in terms of the space accumulation and fraction accumulation. That means structures of power in terms of persons, in terms of nationalities, in terms of culture, in terms even religion. We are talking about the same families, for example, involved in the struggles between Guelfos and Girondinos, Ghibellinos in the 12th and 14th century in Europe that are still disputing things within the financial sector. Okay? That happens. But at the same time, you have another logic linked to the reproduction of the nation state, the reproduction of the social spaces, the coherence that you require in order to provide your own markets. New productive capabilities require new markets. It is not possible to have profits if you don't have markets, and it is impossible to have markets if you do not provoke revenues. That is the course of capitalism. They would rather prefer to have a market without people. But that is, unfortunately, not yet possible, yet. So, we need to pay attention to the dynamics with a lot of inertia, a lot of systemic inertia, the dynamic of these attractors. When you have this productive, it is not the same, look, be careful with the methodologies of the value chain, what is in fashion. This is fashion, this is manipulated, there is nothing technical and nothing natural with respect to the hierarchy of the smiling curve. That is artificially created by the intellectual property laws, artificially created by rent-seeking conditions in the negotiations among the states. What is intrinsic to the ontologic hierarchy in the production of use values is related, first of all, to agriculture. The illusory nature of the so-called service economy disintegrates the moment in which you don't have bread. If you do not assure, one of our friends, he was asking a very crucial question. It is not only related to food sovereignty, it is related to the viability of alternative societal constructions. If you are not capable to assure an excedent, a surplus in physical food, it is impossible to support a revolutionary process, independently of the name and independently of the political and ideological orientation. And the same happens with capitalism, and the same happens with socialism, and the same happens with whatever other name you want to do. So you have on one hand the hierarchy of this, the production of food. The rest is derived from the success that you had in the basics. And of course, you have the crucial dynamics of creativity through the transformative possibilities around energy and information. So any capability that a society could concentrate around anti-entropic efforts is crucial for the success of any type of endeavor. So, related to this, you have a matrix, a productive matrix. You have an input-output matrix that could be manipulated because of the management of the relative prices. Subsidies, manipulation of the international prices, manipulation of the interest rates, preference in the donation of credit, or, for example, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. Contrary to what happens to any other transnational, the transnationals that with residence in the United States had the privilege of the issuing, ex nihilo issuing of dollars. So that's a limit capability of purchasing power creation that do not have any other fraction of monopoly capital anywhere. So when you see the attractor that, for example, China means in the international trade from the side of exports and from the side of imports, that redefines the capability of imperialistic manipulation because of objective interest. So you have, just to show you very rapidly, this in terms of the attractor from the international trade. In terms of the reorientation, the geographical reorientation of the trade, not only with respect to the north, the traditional poles of the traditional nodes of the core of capitalism, but the south-south trends in trade. Then the interpolation and the increasing sophistication of hierarchical, more significant parts of the input-output matrix. That means the production of means of production for the production of means of production that assures the long-term coherence of a process of innovation. And that has been in a very, very deep part assured, for example, by China, in terms of another horizon of regional integration in Asia, even with historical enemies, even with political enemies, like Japan, South Korea, etc., etc. If we could project those type of international flows, if we could assure we can deepen this type of attractors in terms of the construction of another economic order, international order, the possibilities of independence, the possibilities of relaunching capitalist economies all around the world are totally viable. In terms of employment, very, very rapidly, opposite to what happens to the old stagnant economies in the center of the empire, the Keynesian multipliers. It doesn't matter which is your methodology. The Keynesian multipliers of any stimulus package, being from the fiscal sector, being from the monetary sector, or being from the external sector, are much more powerful in the global south than in the center of the empire. So any dollar spent in China, in Ecuador, in Argentina, in Indonesia is much more productive for the global economy than the same dollar spent in the United States or England. So, okay, we have a lot of things to say. So let me characterize this situation about the structural, systemic. I'm not talking about a caprice in terms of my preferences in the characterization of the system. When we are talking about the structural factors, we are talking about medular phenomena, essential phenomena, without sine qua non condition. The condition without it is impossible that the process continue. Look at this. One of the characteristics in the transformation from the Fordist Keynesian regime of accumulation to the neoliberal regime of accumulation is this gap between here in the black dots is the consumption share of the GDP, while in the black dots you have the labor share of the GDP. The constitution, the essentiality, the crucial characteristic, the crucial feature of the Fordist regime of accumulation was Henry Ford recipe to transform its own workers from a cost that must be abated into a market. So when that was generalized, that was the construction of the American hegemony. Because the higher the revenues, the most dynamic the market. This co-evolution was broken with the neoliberal policies. Of course, they provoked higher profit rates in the short term, but they killed the golden egg goose. Because if you cannot buy, how can you increase your consumption if your revenues are frozen? I'm making the question. How can you fill the gap between consumption that goes up with the neoliberal postmodern markets, but salaries going down? But you can find exactly the same statistics for continental Europe and Japan. And that is precisely the key for much more independent possibilities of handling the Chinese economy in the current conjuncture. The gap was filled with credit. So when we are talking about over-indebtment, we are talking about an essential structural feature of the current regime of accumulation. If this spree of consumption, this irrational exuberance, in the words of Alan Greenspan, were not occur, you have a depression from here. If the consumption followed the same path than the revenues, you have a restriction in the possibility of selling, a restriction in the effective demand from the beginning of the 80s. So the crisis was not starting today, but it was 40 years old. And the opposite, that is why it's structural. If you are trying to correct this, and that is happening, you are reducing consumption, but then deleverage implies depression. The deeper the level of this indebtedness, the deeper the depression. And very closely, follow this. I'm not being exhaustive here, but just to characterize what I'm telling you, what I mean when I'm talking about systemic features. Look, here you have the rate of profit again, but this time not as a proportion of invested capital, but as a proportion of the GDP. And I'm finishing with this. Compare this, the co-evolution that you had in the previous years of the Fordist Keynesian era, with the investment production. You want more, you invest more. The more profitable the market, the most incentives for you to invest. But that was broken with the neoliberal policies. Yeah, profitability went up. But as the crisis of overproduction was evident, they need to asphyxiate the productive investment. So the problem is, what happens with all this money? And then it appears the irrational exuberance as the solution. How to find profitable opportunities for investment for larger and larger, increasing larger amounts of profits without increasing the productive capability. The financial market. A financial market each time more and more delinked from the real economy. That is not a matter of irresponsibility. That is not a matter of neglected markets or negligent regulators. That is not a matter of crazy investors. That is not a matter of failure in the mathematical models. That is a structural need of the system. They need to delink the dynamics of investment, of profitable investment, from the dynamics of increasing of productive capabilities, because we are in the middle of an overproduction crisis. So again, this is structural, but is also structural the remedy. What happens if all the trillions that I showed you in the previous session, what happens if all the trillions of dollars, euros, yens, yuans finally could find a channel to go into the productive sector? Catastrophe for capitalism. If all those trillions are transformed in productive investment, that is going to be a sideral exacerbation of the overproduction crisis. And that is going to flood the planet of too cheap merchandises for the aspirations of profit of the monopolies. That is why I've been arguing about the political possibilities, the dangerously easy capabilities that have the peoples of the world to push for another agenda. It doesn't matter if this is capitalist, because those new productive capabilities cannot provide the rates of profit that those monopolistic capitals require. Cannot compete with the very, very short-termism of the high-frequency trade. The average of keeping a bond, a title in the United States is 22 seconds. Which productive cycle could compete with those alternatives, those alternative opportunities of investment? That is why it is the peoples, politically, with sovereignty, that must tame capitalism and to put humankind before the greed of capitalism. And we have plenty of possibilities to do it. It is only the political construction, the correlation of forces beyond any dogmatism that today, here, everywhere could make this possible. Thank you very much.